There are things you just can't unsee. Like the look in someone's eyes when they waited for you with their heart wide open and were met with silence. Sometimes, what hurts isn't the shouting, it's the empty chair, it's the plate no one set for you. And the worst part? It's when they swore it would be different. Come, Grandma, it won't be the same without you. But it was. And it was worse. The truth is, there's a wound almost nobody talks about: abandonment disguised as an invitation. That fake promise of belonging, thrown out just to check a box or ease someone else's guilt. And when we fall into that trap, what's left isn't just loneliness, it's shame for having believed in it. But this story doesn't end where most people think it does. Because there's a moment when everything shifts. In this story, you'll follow a powerful journey of someone who rose again after being forgotten. Irene isn't just a character, she's a mirror for so many silenced voices, for grandmothers, for mothers, for people who've felt like leftovers at the very feast they helped build. But she is also living proof that it's possible to rewrite your legacy with dignity, with courage, with an unconditional love for yourself. You will feel anger. You might cry. But most of all, you'll walk away stronger. Because every line is a reminder it's never too late to choose yourself again. It's never too late to build a real family, even if it begins with a dinner table for one. Are you ready to dive into this transformation? Because after today, you'll think twice before you ever leave your own chair empty. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the phone rang. Irene, sitting in her armchair by the window, recognized the name immediately: Greg. Her son. The one who rarely called, always too busy with life, with work, with his kids, with the world. But that day, his voice was different. Softer, warmer, more present. Mom, we want you here for Thanksgiving. It just won't be the same without you. Those words cut straight through Irene's chest like a beam of sunlight warming the coldest winter. For the first time in a long time, she felt remembered, truly remembered. Not out of obligation. Not out of convenience. But out of desire. Out of belonging. It sounded like a hug. She didn't say yes right away. She felt the weight of surprise, of wonder, like hearing an old song you thought you'd forgotten. Are you sure, Greg? She asked, in a voice almost childlike, afraid the offer might vanish if she breathed too hard. But he reassured her, of course, Mom. We miss you. The kids ask about you all the time. Irene smiled, that kind of half-smile that hides the tears you don't want to let fall. Deep inside, something lit up. A small flame, but alive. Maybe this was the restart she'd been waiting for. Maybe this time would be different. And for the first time in years, she believed it. As she hung up, Irene felt something her heart hadn't held in ages: self-worth. That call wasn't just an invitation to dinner, it was a kind of rescue. As if they were saying, you still matter. You still belong here. She couldn't help but remember all those other years: the generic invitations, the last-minute excuses, the happy holiday texts followed by silence. But this felt real. And she wanted to believe it. The loneliness that had wrapped around her like a heavy blanket lifted, just enough to let her walk a little taller through her house. What few people understand is that for someone who has felt excluded, even the smallest sign of belonging becomes a lighthouse. Irene, with all her inner strength, carried years of forced silences and rejections dressed up as politeness. And yet, a handful of sweet words was enough to spark her courage again. She didn't want to live on the sidelines of her own story anymore. That phone call was more than an invitation. It was a request for her return. A gesture of unconditional love, at least, she wanted to believe it was. For her, it felt like being seen, chosen, recognized. Hope has a way of sneaking back in, even into the most wounded hearts. Irene spent that whole day smiling to herself, hugging little memories, mentally packing her suitcase. She thought about her grandkids, about the smell of the turkey roasting, about the laughter around the table. She imagined herself once again being part of the family ritual, not just some old piece of furniture nobody wanted to throw away, but nobody used either. Dignity was trickling back in, and with it, the desire to give of herself again. She didn't even realize it yet, but she was already rebuilding. For years, Irene had lived with absence. And like so many, she started to normalize being forgotten. She accepted emotional crumbs, telling herself it was better than nothing. But that invitation, oh, that invitation. It broke the cycle. It brought clarity. For the first time, it seemed someone saw her as more than an obligation. It was a chance to restore bonds, to live love with dignity, without having to beg for it. Irene hadn't asked to be invited. She was wanted. And that made all the difference. Freedom began right there, even if she didn't yet know it. As the sun went down, Irene stepped out onto her porch, watched the sky turn orange, and let one single tear fall. Not of sadness, but of recognition. It felt as if the universe itself was returning a little of what she had poured out all her life: care, presence, generosity. She thought of the Christmases she had organized alone, of the birthdays she celebrated even when no one celebrated her, of the countless nights she had worried about everyone else, even as she was forgotten. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally changing. And the idea of belonging was no longer fantasy, it was turning into a plan. A reality. Greg had no idea what his words meant to her. For him, it might have just been a polite phrase, a natural gesture. But for Irene, it was like being handed an award after years of fighting battles in silence. That night, she lay down with her heart warm, feeling included, feeling loved. As if, at last, time had delivered her a little emotional justice. There was something there that wasn't just hope, it was faith. Faith that she still had worth. That she could still build a legacy of affection and truth. This was the beginning of a new chapter. And she was ready. There are things you just can't unsee. Like the look in someone's eyes when they waited with their heart wide open and were met with silence. Sometimes, what hurts isn't the shouting, it's the empty chair, the plate no one set for you. And the worst part? It's when they swore it would be different. Come, Grandma, it won't be the same without you. But it was. And it was worse. The truth is, there's a wound hardly anyone talks about: abandonment disguised as invitation. That false promise of belonging, made only to ease guilt or to look good. And when you fall into that trap, what's left isn't just loneliness, it's shame for having believed it. But this story doesn't end where most people think it does. Because there comes a moment when everything turns. This is the story of a powerful journey, of someone who rose again after being forgotten. Irene isn't just a character, she is a mirror of so many silenced voices, of grandmothers, mothers, people who once felt like leftovers at the banquet they helped build. But she is also living proof that it is possible to rewrite your own legacy with dignity, courage, and unconditional love for yourself. You will feel anger, maybe cry, but above all you will come out stronger. Because every line is a reminder it is never too late to choose yourself again. It is never too late to build a real family, even if it begins with a dinner table for one. Are you ready to dive into this transformation? Because after today, you will think twice before leaving your own chair empty. It was a regular Tuesday when the phone rang. Irene, sitting in her armchair by the window, recognized the name right away: Greg. Her son. The one who rarely called, always too busy with his life, with his children, with the world. But that day, his voice sounded different. Softer, warmer, more present. Mom, we want you here for Thanksgiving. It just won't be the same without you. Those words pierced Irene's chest like sunlight breaking through winter. For the first time in a long time, she felt remembered, truly remembered. Not out of duty, not out of convenience, but out of genuine desire. Out of belonging. It felt like a hug. She didn't say yes immediately. She felt the weight of surprise, of enchantment, like someone hearing an old song they thought they'd forgotten. Are you sure, Greg? She asked, almost childlike, afraid the offer might evaporate. But he assured her, of course, Mom. We miss you. The kids ask about you all the time. Irene smiled, that restrained smile of someone holding back tears, not wanting to ruin the moment. Inside her, something lit up. A small flame, but alive. Maybe this was a new beginning. Maybe this time would be different. And for the first time in years, she believed it. As she hung up, Irene felt something she hadn't felt in years' worth. That call wasn't just an invitation to dinner, it was a kind of rescue. As if they were saying, "You still matter. You still belong here." She couldn't help remembering the previous years, the generic invitations, the last-minute excuses, the happy holidays messages on WhatsApp followed by silence. But now it seemed real. And she wanted to believe. The loneliness that had wrapped around her like a heavy blanket gave way to a lightness that let her stand taller in her own home. What most people don't understand is that for someone who has been excluded, even the smallest sign of belonging becomes a lighthouse. Irene, despite her inner strength, carried years of forced silences, of rejections disguised as kindness. And yet, a few gentle words were enough to spark her courage again. She didn't want to live at the margins of her own story anymore. That call was more than an invitation, it was a request for her return. A gesture of unconditional love, at least she wanted to believe it was. For her, it was as if she had finally been seen, chosen, acknowledged. Hope has a way of slipping back into even the most wounded hearts. Irene spent the rest of the day smiling to herself, embracing little memories, mentally organizing what she would pack. She thought about her grandchildren, about the smell of turkey roasting, about laughter around the table. She pictured herself once again part of that family ritual, no longer the forgotten piece of furniture nobody used but nobody threw away either. Dignity returned little by little, and with it, her desire to give again. She didn't even notice, but she was already rebuilding. For years, Irene had learned to live with absence. Like many, she began to normalize being forgotten. She accepted emotional crumbs, telling herself it was better than nothing. But that invitation, it broke the cycle. It brought clarity. For the first time, it seemed like someone saw her as more than an obligation. It was the chance to restore bonds, to live love with dignity, without begging for it. Irene hadn't asked to be invited. She had been wanted. And that made all the difference. Freedom began right there, though she didn't know it yet. That evening as the sun set, Irene walked out onto her porch, looked at the orange sky, and let a single tear fall. Not out of sadness, but of recognition. It was as if the universe itself was returning a little of what she had poured out all her life: care, presence, generosity. She remembered the Christmases she organized alone, the birthdays she celebrated without anyone celebrating her, the nights she worried about everyone even while being forgotten. Now maybe things were changing. Belonging stopped being fantasy, it became plan. Reality. Greg had no idea what his words meant. For him, it was just a polite phrase, a simple gesture. For Irene, it was like winning an award after years of silent battles. That night she went to bed with her heart warm, feeling included, feeling loved. As if, finally, time had delivered emotional justice. It wasn't just hope, it was faith. Faith that she still had value. That she could still build a legacy of affection and truth. This was the beginning of a restart. And she was ready. The next morning, Irene woke up with an energy she hadn't felt in years. It was as if something inside her had regained its color. With a notebook in hand, she wrote a list of what to take. Not just clothes, but thoughtful details: a hand-embroidered tablecloth, books her grandchildren might enjoy, little gifts she had been saving for the right moment. Excitement vibrated inside her chest like in the days when she used to prepare family parties at her own home. Now, it seemed they were finally giving her that place back. That afternoon, she wandered through the city, carefully choosing presents. In a clothing shop, she fell in love with a navy blue cardigan with pearl buttons. "Classic, elegant, warm, just like you," said the saleswoman, not realizing how deeply those words touched Irene. She bought it without hesitation, feeling beautiful, confident. It was more than clothing, it was armor. That piece would carry not just style but history. It would be her embrace if things didn't go as planned. Irene wanted to be prepared, but she also wanted to believe Greg's promises. The following day, she scheduled time at the hairdresser's. She colored her hair, did her nails, picked out a new perfume. It was a ritual of rescue, of rediscovery. Looking in the mirror, she saw more than just a grandmother, more than a mother. She saw the woman who had been hidden behind curtains of waiting for far too long. Irene knew she was preparing for a special occasion, but the care she put into each detail meant more than the event. It was her way of telling the world and herself that she still mattered. Her self-esteem, weakened by years of silence, was beginning to breathe again. She booked a comfortable flight. No exhausting layovers or cramped seats. For the first time in a long time, she chose her own comfort before anyone else's. That in itself was a revolution. Clicking through the seating chart, she remembered the times she had traveled tired, crammed, carrying bags and expectations only to be forgotten in the corner of some living room. This time would be different. She was traveling as a presence, not a burden. Every detail of that trip was a statement. Irene was not leftover. She was not extra. She was essential, and she deserved to arrive as such. In her suitcase, along with clothes and gifts, she placed a letter she had been writing for months. She didn't know if she would give it, but she brought it just in case. It was a confession, a silent plea for recognition. Writing it had been therapeutic, even if it was never read. She also packed old photos, where everyone smiled together, from a time before wounds deepened. She wanted to believe it was still possible to rebuild. Her suitcase didn't just carry items, it carried memories, attempts, and one last spark of hope. Closing the zipper, she knew it wasn't just a trip. It was a leap. At home, she prepared everything with care. She watered the plants, paid the bills, left post-it notes with reminders. Irene was meticulous, and at that moment, organization was more than habit. It was a way to stay in control amid the storm of emotions. Each task completed reduced her anxiety, told her she could relax and look forward to the reunion. Preparing for Thanksgiving became a ritual of liberation. Waiting, which for years had meant pain, now carried purpose, maybe even renewal. On the eve of her trip, she received a voice message from Greg. He said everyone was excited, the kids wanted to know what she would cook, and that Meline, her daughter-in-law, was preparing a room for her. Her heart almost couldn't contain itself. Those little confirmations worked like bandages over old wounds. She caught herself smiling genuinely, like someone learning to trust again. Even without knowing what truly awaited, Irene decided to believe. And that choice alone was already an act of courage, of self-worth, of faith. The night before her flight, Irene left everything ready: suitcase by the door, cardigan laid neatly on the chair, passport in her bag. She made a light soup and ate alone in silence, but this time, not with emptiness. There was a strange joy there. Not euphoria, but serenity. She knew she was moving for herself, not out of obligation to hold fragile ties together. She was going because she wanted to, because she chose to. And even without guarantees, that was enough. Irene went to bed early. Tomorrow would mark something new. Something she had only dreamed of. The plane landed gently in Minneapolis, and Irene felt a familiar chill run up her spine. It wasn't only the icy wind slicing through the airport glass, it was the chill of doubt, the kind that creeps in when the heart wants to believe, but the mind has learned to protect itself. With her rolling suitcase in one hand and her new cardigan draped over her shoulders, she walked toward the designated meeting spot, scanning faces for Greg, or anyone from the family. She watched as others embraced, flowers exchanged, shouts of "finally" filled the air. She was there. Whole. Present. Waiting to be seen. Minutes began to weigh. 10. 15. 20. Irene refused to sit. She stood tall, her posture firm, as if that alone could preserve her dignity. She wanted to look strong when they arrived. Beautiful. Ready. Each family reunion unfolding around her was a reminder of what she lacked. She offered polite smiles to strangers, trying to hide her discomfort. Her phone remained silent. No message. No call. But she still believed. Delays happen. Traffic. Kids. Chaos. Normal, she told herself, ignoring the tightness in her chest. Nearly an hour passed. Irene finally checked her phone. No updates. No explanations. No apologies. Silence was starting to scream. She tried calling, but the call went straight to voicemail. Looking around, she searched for an airport staff member, maybe hoping for an excuse to move without looking defeated. But her eyes betrayed her. She was being forgotten. Again. And this time, in front of everyone. Still, she stood her ground. Dignified. She would not let that moment turn her invisible. Not anymore. Watching a family embrace with joy, Irene felt the floor sway under her. It wasn't dizziness, it was realization. She wasn't expected. Not that day. Maybe never. But something inside her refused to accept rejection as normal. She took a deep breath, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and walked slowly to one of the lounge chairs. She sat carefully, deliberately, like someone with nothing left to prove. Abandonment wasn't new, it was just a repeat. The difference? Now she saw it clearly. She sat for a while longer, observing the announcements, the staff rushing, the laughter of children. She felt out of place, but strangely lucid. For the first time, she didn't cry. The pain was different, dry, mature. Not drama. A discreet kind of mourning, like burying an old hope. She pulled a tissue from her bag and cleaned her glasses. She needed to see clearly. Everything. Including the truth she had disguised with excuses for years. She wasn't a priority. Maybe she never was. But something new was beginning right there. Then a notification appeared on her phone. A photo. Slowly it loaded, and when it appeared fully, the impact was quiet but sharp. The whole family gathered around the table, laughing, toasting, plates full, children in laps, candles glowing. And she, alone, with her suitcase still unpacked. The caption read, "Our favorite Thanksgiving." Irene's heart froze for a moment. Not anger. Not shock. But understanding. She hadn't been forgotten. She had been excluded. And that difference, subtle but devastating, cut deeper than any silence. She closed her phone gently, like closing a book. It wasn't worth insisting anymore. Not worth inventing excuses. Irene stood slowly, adjusted her coat, inhaled deeply, and started walking aimlessly. The pain wasn't new, but something had shifted. For the first time, she didn't feel ashamed of being alone. She felt a strange kind of relief, as if part of the burden had been dropped right there in the crowded terminal. Now she knew. Now she saw. It didn't matter how much she tried. Where there is no room, you can't force yourself to fit. Walking through the airport corridors, her steps found rhythm. It wasn't escape, it was liberation. Exclusion, though painful, brought with it a kind of clarity no fake hug could ever give. She didn't yet know where she was headed, but she knew she would never return to that same place, that same role of always waiting, always accepting. Something was being born in the middle of her solitude. A strength that only blooms when everything else crumbles. Irene no longer had anything to lose. But for the first time in years, she had something to gain. Outside, she wandered near the airport streets, keeping her phone tucked in her bag, as if avoiding further blows. Silence hurt less than another notification. But the image of the table, the smiles, haunted her. She remembered Greg's voice on the phone, "It won't be the same without you." Now, watching them so full, so content without her, those words felt like mockery. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was refusal. A decision. And the cruelest part, wrapped in affection. She sat on a bench by a small square. The cold wind bit her skin, but she barely noticed. Abandonment, when explicit, stings. But when it comes wrapped in promises and false warmth, it shreds you. Irene couldn't cry. It was as if her emotions had frozen. Her body whispered not again. But her mind wouldn't stop. It replayed every detail, the cardigan, the gifts, the careful planning. Now, all of it seemed ridiculous. Humiliating. Yet she didn't feel defeated. Just empty. Almost instinctively, she pulled out her phone again and saw the comments under the photo. Hundreds of them. Beautiful family. What a table. Nothing better than being with those you love. Each one felt like a stab. Irene felt erased from her own family's story. As if her absence wasn't ignored, but preferred. Her not being there didn't leave a hole, it brought them relief. And that truth was bitterer than any fight. There were no arguments, no shouting. Just indifference. Indifference. That word echoed. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's this. Being irrelevant, invisible, disposable. Irene had always avoided confrontations, choosing silence to keep peace. But the price had been too high. And now, seeing them celebrate without her, there was no anger left. Only clarity. Rejection, when repeated with elegance, becomes a system. And she had been part of it, agreeing to her own exclusion for the sake of holding ties together. But what ties? Where was the unconditional love she had believed in? She stood slowly. She needed to move. She entered a small cafe with an old sign, Tinus. One of those places where time seems to pause. She ordered a slice of apple pie and a black coffee. She sat by the window alone. For the first time in years, no one interrupted her. No one needed her. No one demanded anything. And strangely, it brought her peace. Maybe it was there, in that simple place, that she would begin rebuilding. No perfect setting. No forced company. Just her. For her. Eating slowly, watching steam rise from her cup, Irene felt something shift inside. Not sadness, clarity. The moment was bitter, but also revealing. The world was finally showing its true face. And for the first time, she accepted it. No excuses. No masks. It wasn't about being a good or bad mother, a good or bad mother-in-law. It was about choices. And they had chosen life without her. Hard truth, but freeing. The dignity she felt there, in that cheap cafe, was greater than in any false banquet she had endured. Looking around, she noticed others alone. An old man with a newspaper. A young woman typing on a laptop. A teenager with headphones. All in silence. All whole. And suddenly, Irene realized being alone doesn't mean being lost. She was not a mistake. Not a burden. Not extra. She was a woman. A grandmother. A presence. Even if others didn't recognize her, she was starting to recognize herself. It didn't erase the pain, but it changed its direction. Because once you truly see yourself, even wounded, you begin to rebuild. Before leaving, she tipped generously and smiled warmly at the waitress. She walked to a nearby motel. She needed rest. She had nowhere to go, and for the first time, that didn't feel like failure. It felt like beginning uncertain, yes, but hers. Irene moved with no map, no script, no guarantees. But now, with a piece of strength that belonged only to her. That slice of pie was more than dessert. It was a silent vow never again would she beg for a seat at someone else's table. If she had to, she would build her own. The motel room was small but clean. Light walls, a simple bedspread, an odd sense of comfort. Irene entered quietly, dragging her suitcase. No perfume in the air, no polished furniture, but silence. Silence that didn't accuse, didn't demand, didn't reject. For the first time in years, she was in a place that required nothing from her. No need to smile politely. No need to measure words. There, she was just herself. Whole. Hurt, yes. But alive. And that was enough. She sat on the bed and took off her shoes. She was tired, but not exhausted. This tiredness was different, the kind that comes after long effort to be accepted, finally dissolving. She stretched out, leaned against the pillows, eyes drifting to the ceiling. The pain was still there, but it had made room for something else. Something like calm. Not the bought kind, but the kind that only comes after storms. By being shut out, she had been returned to herself. A strange rebirth, in silence. She opened her suitcase and pulled out her old leather notebook, pages yellowed with time. Inside were scribbles, fragments from when writing was her only escape. That night, for the first time in years, She wanted to write again. She took the pen and let it flow. I am not extra. I am not leftover. She read it aloud. Again. And again. Like a mantra, like a scream that finally found space. Simple. But true. She remembered how many times she had stayed silent to keep the peace. How many times she had shrunk to avoid burdening others. How many times she had given everything, waiting for the smallest recognition. It never came. And still, she kept going. Out of love, out of habit, out of fear. But now, alone in that room, Irene realized the deepest wound wasn't the abandonment of others, it was the abandonment she inflicted on herself, day after day. That clarity hurt. But it freed her. She turned on the television, not to watch, but to hear voices that demanded nothing. A news anchor's monotone filled the room while she washed her face in the bathroom. Staring into the mirror, she saw her red eyes, her tired skin, but also something new. A timid glow. Like a faint light in fog. Alone with the towel in her hands, Irene felt something greater than sadness. Respect. The kind that begins inside, when you decide you will not erase yourself for anyone again. Back in bed, she pulled the covers up and closed her eyes. She didn't ask the universe for anything. She made no promises. She simply let the silence wrap her like a real blanket. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking of what others were doing, saying, or feeling. She was thinking only of herself. And it felt strange. And it felt good. Solitude, once punishment, was now refuge. A space where her voice could finally echo, not into emptiness, but into presence. During the night, she woke once or twice. Not from nightmares, but from memories arriving like soft waves. Faces, voices, scents. Each passing like a farewell. And she let them go. She no longer wanted to hold on. No longer needed to prove anything. If pain came, it would come. But clean. Honest. Irene was tired of a world where she begged for space. In that thin mattress, beneath that worn blanket, she discovered something essential, what she truly needed, no one could give her. Only herself. At dawn, the light slipped delicately through the thin curtains. Irene woke with her face turned toward the window. She took a deep breath. It was another day. And with it, came another choice. She rose slowly, ran her hand through her hair, and walked to the mirror. She was no longer searching for youth or perfection. She was searching for truth. And there, in her own reflection, she found it. She wasn't the woman everyone had always expected her to be. She was the woman she needed to be now. And with that came courage. Not the kind to confront anyone, but the courage to stop begging. For the first time in a long while, she was enough for herself. The sun was already present when Irene walked down to the motel's small cafe. The smell of warm bread mixed with the strong aroma of freshly brewed coffee. She sat at a table near the window, watching the street outside. Cars passing by, people hurrying with shopping bags, children with backpacks on their shoulders. Life carried on, indifferent to what she had lived through the day before. But inside her, everything felt different. For the first time, she sensed that she was in control. Not of the world, but of herself. Of what she allowed, of what she expected, of what she believed she deserved. The waiting now was only for herself. She went back to the room after breakfast, and when she opened her notebook again, there was no hesitation. Her hand flowed freely across the pages, as if words that had been choked for years had finally found a way out. She wrote about everything: the interrupted conversations, the forgotten birthdays, the calls that never came. She detailed the moments when she was present yet treated as absent. But she also wrote about clarity. About how the silence of exclusion, though cruel, had been the very key that opened a new door. Irene was writing to remember. To make sure that, once again, the pain would not be erased by the attempt to forget. For years, she had feared being seen as dramatic, as the one who complains, the one who gets hurt too easily. So she swallowed it down. She swallowed the disdain disguised as jokes, the dismissiveness hidden behind excuses, the empty well-talk soon that never happened. But now, on that page, she poured out without filter everything she had swallowed in the name of keeping the peace. Peace bought with silence is not peace. It's prison, she wrote. And as she finished that sentence, she felt a shiver down her back. It was as if she had finally spoken something that needed to be spoken even if no one else would ever read it. She decided to go for a walk. No rush, no destination. Just the desire to move her body. With every step, she felt like she was leaving fragments of an old cycle behind. She stopped at a newsstand, bought a book of short stories, and a hot chocolate. A simple gesture, yet powerful. Irene realized she no longer had to wait for someone else's affection to feel loved. She could give it to herself. That was where true self-worth was born. Without applause, without an audience. Just her choices, and the freedom of no longer begging for a place where she was never celebrated. Back in her room, she played some music on her phone. Something soft, instrumental, that filled the air without suffocating it. She lay on the bed and flipped through the pages of the book she had just bought. The words danced before her eyes, but her mind kept circling back to what she had written earlier. I am not extra. I am not leftover. It echoed like something sacred. How many times in her life had she accepted the role of a background character in other people's stories? How many times had she settled for last-minute invitations, hollow memories, conditional affection? Not anymore. Irene knew she deserved to be at the center. At the core. That afternoon, she picked up her phone again. Messages from Greg. Short, vague. Hey Mom. Everything okay? You really came? It was just a misunderstanding. She read them slowly, without anger, but also without response. Not because she wanted to punish, but because this time, she needed time just for herself. The noise of excuses no longer reached her like before. What she sought now was deeper emotional justice. And for that, she needed distance. Silence. To hear herself. To rebuild what had been destroyed in the name of keeping up a family image that had never truly existed. As night fell, Irene packed her things carefully. She wasn't leaving, she was deciding. Every folded piece of clothing, every item placed into the suitcase, was a choice. What to carry. What to leave behind. What never to repeat. Before going to sleep, she wrote one final line in her notebook: I have found myself again. And I will not lose myself for anyone. It was a promise. Not for Greg. Not for Emma. But for herself. Because true freedom begins the moment we choose ourselves, even if that means losing others along the way. She fell asleep with lightness. For the first time in years, she slept without the weight of guilt, without the rehearsed script of endless attempts. Just her tired body, her cleansed soul. The motel room, in its simplicity, had become a temple of clarity. A place where pain was seen, felt, and transformed. This wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of a new one. One where Irene would no longer be a supporting character. From now on, every step would be hers. With dignity. With truth. And above all, with courage. Irene woke early, still with the echo of the night reverberating in her chest. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the white curtain, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. She rose, drank a glass of water slowly, as if every sip washed away the dust of broken expectations. She sat at the modest motel table, staring at the empty space in front of her, and thought, how much longer will I allow myself to be invisible? That question settled inside her, firm, impossible to ignore. It was time to choose to keep accepting scraps of presence instead of fullness, or to step into her own. Greg's messages still lingered on her phone. He tried gentle excuses, vague justifications, blaming traffic or being too busy. But Irene now saw that excuses had always been there when it suited them. The reflection that pierced her heart was this: if someone truly wanted you without fear, without shame, they would find a way. Silence isn't always an obstacle, sometimes it's the answer. And she decided she would no longer beg to be included. If they wanted her to be part of their lives, they would have to call her in as part of it for real. She made a mental list of all the things she had given up over the years: trips she never took, celebrations she skipped, opinions she swallowed, conflicts she avoided just to keep the peace. Every time she chose silence in the name of harmony, she sacrificed a piece of herself. She wrote in her notebook, "I gave too much. I became the delegate of my own exclusion." And then she added, "Today I choose me." Her hand trembled with emotion, but it stayed steady. Courage was being born from the realization that her own waiting had been part of the very cycle she now wanted to break. Dignity doesn't ask permission. She decided to revoke the powers of attorney she had granted, to undo financial arrangements that kept her in dependency. Irene contacted the bank, asked for guidance. It was bureaucratic, inconvenient, but liberating. Each document she signed was a declaration to herself: "I am not anyone's tool of control. I will not allow decisions about my life or my legacy to be made by those who do not honor my unconditional love nor my worth." It was a practical step toward autonomy. She stopped answering Greg's messages right away. In the past, she felt she owed explanations. Now she understood she didn't have to sacrifice her peace for those who hadn't shown her respect. She went to sleep with her phone away from her bed, turned off notifications during the day. She went to the park, sat on a bench, watched the trees, breathed deeply. Let the sound of wind through the leaves wash away what still hurt. It was silence by choice, and it was productive. In that silence, she rekindled something she thought she had lost: inner strength. She thought of Emma, her granddaughter. Of the conversation she still wanted to have. She decided to write her a letter not only of material inheritance, but of emotional legacy. Something that would pass on what she had learned: that belonging begins with true love, that real family is sustained by choices and presence, not just by pretty words. She put her feelings on paper, her story, her silent shame, but also her liberation, her courage. She promised Emma she would always support her, but never again at the cost of her own dignity. When she finished writing, she read the letter several times, eyes misty, but with no hesitation. She tucked it into a safe folder, ready for the right moment. And in that process, she discovered something essential: freedom is not the absence of ties, but the presence of yourself. She could love, forgive, but she no longer had to beg for recognition. She no longer had to wait for others' choices to align with her soul. The choice, finally, was hers. And with that certainty, she felt something inside her being reborn. In the end, Irene sought legal help to formalize her decisions. She gathered documents, hired an attorney. She transferred some assets to Emma, she cut off others. Not out of revenge, but out of emotional justice. She was writing a new script for her life, with the clarity of someone who had learned that when you love yourself, you are never excluded from yourself. And in doing so, she realized that her new beginning wasn't some future plan, it was already unfolding. The freedom that once seemed distant was becoming her new reality. In the lawyer's office, Irene sat upright, her calm eyes contrasting with the firmness of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. It wasn't about money, nor revenge. It was about coherence. For the first time, she wanted to ensure her legacy would go to someone who had truly seen her. And that someone was Emma. The girl who, even in silence, had always been present. Who had never demanded, but always offered sincere affection, genuine listening, unconditional love. Irene didn't hesitate. She was ready to change the course of her family's story, at least her part in it. As she reviewed the documents, she remembered Emma showing up with flowers from the garden, or sending simple messages: "Grandma, I thought of you today." Small gestures that, over time, built real belonging. They weren't grand, but they were constant. And constancy is what sustains true love. Irene wanted her granddaughter to know that bond had value not only emotionally. She wanted to show her that recognition is also translated into concrete actions. It was time to put into writing what her heart had decided long ago. The lawyer watched her with quiet admiration. Maybe it wasn't common to see someone with such emotional clarity in that setting. Irene explained everything calmly: "This isn't punishment. It's repair. And more than that, it's choice. For the first time, I'm choosing someone who chose me too. Simple, direct, yet revolutionary. For decades, she had done everything based on others' expectations. Now, she was acting from her own truth. And that truth, even if lonely, was whole. It was fair. And it no longer asked for permission to exist. After signing the papers, Irene returned home with a sense of mission fulfilled. But something was still missing. She needed to write again. Not just another letter, but a letter of intentions. A kind of emotional testament. A document where she could leave in words what couldn't be measured in assets. She spoke of memories, of choices, of silences that had hurt more than screams. And, above all, she spoke of the importance of recognizing oneself. Of refusing to occupy places that shrink your soul. Of building relationships where love doesn't need to be begged. The writing flowed with a clarity she had never experienced before. It was as if all those years of pain were finally serving a purpose. Not for bitterness, but for wisdom. Irene wanted Emma to know that true love begins with yourself. That no inheritance is worth more than the courage to break patterns. That family goes beyond blood, it is choice, it is respect, it is presence. She ended the letter with a sentence that summed it all up: you saw me when no one else did. And now, I want the world to know that you are my choice. She placed the letter in a pretty envelope, along with an old photo of the two of them, laughing in the kitchen while baking cookies. It wasn't a grand memory, but it was real. Irene knew that image carried more value than any luxurious dinner. It was the symbol of real love, unpretentious, full of affection and companionship. As she sealed the envelope, she felt lighter. As if part of her had been reorganized. What once was pain now had direction. What once was emptiness now had a name, a face, and a destination. That night, she lit a candle beside the letter and watched the flame flicker. She thought of how many women, like her, had lived in silence. How many built emotional empires that collapsed for lack of return. How many erased themselves, believing that was love. Irene knew her decision wouldn't change the past, but it could illuminate the future. If not for everyone, then at least for Emma. And that was already big enough. Freeing enough. It was her way of planting respect even if in new soil. Before bed, she wrote one more line in her notebook: my inheritance is also my story. And my story deserves to be passed on to hands that care, not that ignore. She turned off the light in serenity. She knew that from now on, the relationships that remained in her life would be those born of voluntary affection, not obligation. The change in legacy was not only legal, it was spiritual. It was the beginning of a different lineage, one where love isn't demanded, but celebrated. Where silence isn't absence, but a chosen peace. The phone rang in the middle of the afternoon. Irene was watering the plants when she heard the familiar sound. She answered without checking the caller ID, and on the other end, Emma's trembling voice broke the silence. Grandma, I got the letter. You have no idea what it meant to me. There was a pause, as if words needed space not to collapse. Irene smiled, deeply moved. She didn't need long speeches. The emotion in her granddaughter's voice was enough. It was the return of something she thought she had lost: true connection. Real presence. A bond of the soul, not a formality. Emma asked to see her the next day. She wanted to talk, to hug. Irene, with a light heart, agreed. The reunion happened at Emma's house, a small home full of affectionate details. Old photos on the walls, stacks of books, familiar sense of food in the air. As soon as the door opened, the hug came before any words. A long, firm, silent hug. There was no blame, no justification. Just unconditional love. Irene felt the warmth of her granddaughter's hands on her back and understood that, even without a crowd, this was her place of belonging. They spent the afternoon together, like old times. Played chess, laughed at silly moves, recalled childhood stories. Emma brewed coffee while Irene chopped vegetables for dinner. It was a gentle rhythm, intimate, full of little silences that didn't hurt. On the contrary, they comforted. This was what she had always wanted: coexistence with genuine affection, without tension, without fear, without the need to please in order to be accepted. In the simplicity of that moment, Irene felt whole. Not for being forced into a family setting, but for being invited with an open heart. Over dinner, Emma spoke about her life, her doubts, her dreams, and thanked her with teary eyes. "You taught me more with that letter than many people taught me in a lifetime." Irene smiled and squeezed her hand. She didn't need to say anything more. That was emotional justice being done, not with fights, but with care. With listening. With reciprocity. It was as if the world was finally aligned with what she had always believed, that true relationships don't require effort to exist, only intention and mutual care. After dinner, they sat on the porch, each with a cup of tea. Irene looked at the sky and remembered all the nights she had been alone, staring at the same stars, making the same wishes. Now, she didn't need to wish anymore. What was there beside her was more than presence, it was living legacy. Emma represented everything she wanted to preserve: love, respect, and above all, truth. She didn't need a house full of people if she had a heart beside her that truly listened, that truly saw. And that, for her, was worth more than any family feast. The night deepened, and Irene allowed herself something rare, resting on the couch, her feet covered with a blanket. Emma stroked her hair, as if cradling a story. And in a way, that was exactly what it was. Irene no longer needed epic endings, only serene continuity. And in that moment, she understood it isn't the number of people that makes family, but the quality of connection. She could live without crowds, without forced gatherings, as long as she had these true moments. It confirmed what she already knew: her choice, though difficult, had been the right one. Before leaving, Emma handed her an envelope with old drawings she had kept since childhood. Small cards, scribbled "Grandma, I love you," crooked words in colored pencil. Irene held them like a relic. Not for their material worth, but for what they meant: someone had truly seen her. Had always seen her. And now, that same grown person was giving back, in affection, what she had once received as seeds. It was the full circle, without demand, without pressure. Just gratitude. Just love. Irene placed it carefully in her bag and kissed her granddaughter's forehead with reverence. She returned home that night with peace in her heart. The loneliness that once felt like an open wound was now just space. A space she could fill with self-love, with new meaning, with real relationships like the one she had with Emma. She no longer needed to force her presence where she was excluded. From now on, she would cultivate only what made her bloom. And Emma was one of those flowers. Perhaps the most beautiful. Perhaps the strongest. And Irene, at last, felt that her story would not end in pain, but in the rebirth of bonds that had always been there, waiting only for light. The doorbell rang, and Irene answered without surprise. It was Meline. Her voice came wrapped in false softness, a tone Irene knew too well from years of excuses disguised as concern. Irene took a deep breath, opened the door, and welcomed her with the calm of someone who no longer expected anything. Meline quickly began justifying the Thanksgiving episode. "It was all so rushed. We weren't sure if you were really coming." Irene just listened, without interruption, with a serenity that intimidated. She already knew the script, and this time, she wasn't willing to play along. When Meline finished, expecting perhaps quick forgiveness, Irene spoke softly but firmly. "There was no misunderstanding. There was a choice. And it wasn't mine." The words came out steady, stripped clean. Meline tried to argue, to summon the word family, to appeal to ties. But Irene simply replied, "I was family to you. You stopped being mine a long time ago." The silence that followed said it all. There was no bitterness in her voice, only closure. A dignified full stop to a story she would no longer rewrite alone. Meline stood up, unsettled, visibly irritated at not being able to control the outcome. Irene gestured toward the door politely. "I have lunch to make. For myself." Meline left without looking back. Irene, on the other hand, felt lighter. She prepared her meal slowly, as if honoring her own presence. It wasn't vengeance, it was choice. There was no shouting, only respect. For the first time, She set limits without fear of seeming ungrateful. She wrote in her notebook, "It isn't about resentment. It's about self-love." Greg called later that evening. The phone lit up with his name, and for a few seconds, Irene stared at it in silence. She answered. His voice came tense. "Mom, I heard about the bank, about the inheritance." He tried to sound worried, but the tone of demand was evident. Irene listened with the calm of someone who no longer needed to explain herself. When he said she needed to talk to the family before making such serious decisions, she simply replied, "These decisions concern me. And no one consulted me when you left me alone at the airport." Greg tried again. "We're family." And Irene, with a quiet sigh, replied, "I was. You haven't been my family in a long time." He fell silent. It was the first time he had ever heard such words from his mother. He expected resistance, drama. Instead, he found clarity. There was no ground left for emotional manipulation. Irene hung up shortly after, without fights, without long explanations. She had said what mattered, and what mattered was truth. She no longer needed to be understood by him. She only needed to remain in peace with her own choices. On the porch, with a cup of tea in hand, Irene gazed at the sky. The call hadn't shaken her, it had freed her. She thought about all the years she had waited for Greg to truly see her. Now she realized the waiting itself had been the mistake. Clarity came like balm. It was the end of a cycle. She hadn't stopped loving, but she had learned to love herself more. And that changed everything. The next morning, Irene woke early and decided to celebrate her own company. She made breakfast the way she liked, played soft music, and lit a candle on the table. Next to her coffee rested a small gift, a chess piece the Queen wrapped with care for Emma. "With a short note for you, who taught me to play again." It was a gesture of love and continuity. It wasn't about forgiveness or the past. It was about the future and about truth. After breakfast, she went into the garden and planted a few flowers. She felt herself part of the earth, part of time, part of her own story. The dirt on her hands symbolized what she now cultivated: freedom. That afternoon, she wrote down plans in a new notebook: classes, short trips, recipes. Nothing grand, but everything genuine. Autonomy wasn't in grand gestures, but in the small rituals of someone who decided to live with purpose. That evening, she cooked herself a simple dinner and lit another candle. She sat at the table alone, not as someone abandoned, but as someone whole. She looked around and felt the house was finally full. Not of voices, but of presence. Her own presence. Before bed, she wrote one last line: "I am enough." And with that, she drifted into sleep in peace, not because everything was resolved, but because she had finally chosen herself. How many times have you felt the need to fit into spaces that clearly weren't made for you? How many times have you accepted crumbs, thinking they were enough, simply because they were called family? Irene shows us that when self-love finally awakens, everything changes. It doesn't turn pain into joy, but it turns pain into direction. She didn't take revenge, she didn't scream, she didn't beg. She simply chose herself. And that was the most powerful turning point of her life. Maybe you're in a similar moment. Maybe you're still waiting for an invitation, for validation, for a reminder. But what if what you really need is the courage to step out of the waiting line and build your own table? Freedom isn't the absence of bonds. It's the presence of yourself. It's knowing your worth doesn't depend on being accepted, it depends on accepting yourself. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who also needs to remember that it's never too late to start again. And of course, stay tuned for more stories that heal, provoke, and transform. Because here, we talk about life as it is and about how it can become more truly yours. And so, Irene's days began to unfold in a rhythm she had never known before. A rhythm not dictated by demands, by guilt, or by obligations disguised as love, but by choice. She started noticing details she had long overlooked: the way the light touched her plants in the morning, the comfort of warm tea in her hands, the silence that once felt heavy but now carried peace. Each of these moments became evidence that she could exist fully without depending on approval from those who had diminished her presence. Greg and Meline still lingered on the edges of her mind, but their weight was no longer chains. They were shadows she could acknowledge without being consumed. Their absence no longer felt like abandonment, but clarity. She had spent a lifetime knocking on doors that only opened halfway, begging to be seen, to be valued. Now she understood, if someone cannot see you when you are standing right in front of them, no amount of begging will open their eyes. That vision has to come from them, and until it does, you have every right to walk away. Emma's presence, however, had become the anchor that reminded Irene of the beauty of true bonds. The young woman's words, her warmth, her consistency, they showed Irene that love does not have to be loud to be real. Love can be quiet, steady, reliable. Love can show up in small gestures that grow roots far deeper than any grand promise. Irene often found herself holding Emma's drawings or rereading her letter, not because she doubted their meaning, but because she wanted to remember what being chosen felt like. The community around Irene slowly began to change as well. At the park, neighbors she had barely noticed before started greeting her. A woman from the cafe recognized her after a few visits and began to save her a seat near the window. These were small connections, yet each one was a thread weaving a new fabric of belonging. She was no longer invisible because she no longer treated herself as invisible. Her days grew filled with new routines. She signed up for a local cooking class, something she had always wanted but never dared to try. She spent afternoons experimenting with recipes, laughing at her own mistakes, savoring the freedom of not needing perfection to feel joy. She found a small group of women in the neighborhood who gathered weekly to share stories, books, and tea. Irene brought her own story carefully at first, but with time, she realized that sharing it wasn't just about her healing, it was about giving others permission to heal too. In quiet moments, she still thought of Thanksgiving, of the airport, of the photographs where her absence had been so visible. But instead of pain, those memories now served as markers. They reminded her of where she had been and how far she had come. She no longer replayed the question, "Why didn't they want me there?" Instead, she embraced the answer, "Because I was meant to be here, with myself, building something new." And in that realization, Irene found strength that no apology from Greg or Meline could ever give her. The strength of finally knowing that love, true, enduring, healing love begins and ends with the choice you make for yourself.